She wasn't just a nurse. They didn't know that. He had no idea who was standing 3 feet away from him in ICU Bay 7, adjusting a ventilator with hands that had done this exact motion in a sandstorm with mortars falling. Dr. Marcus Ashford watched Hannah Clarke work the night shift like he watched all his staff, as interchangeable parts in a machine he controlled. 3 years. Invisible. That was the plan. But on a Tuesday at 2:48 a.m., muscle memory doesn't lie, and Ashford's eyes caught something in the way her fingers found the carotid pulse on a trauma admission without looking, the 45-second primary survey her body performed on autopilot. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess. Her assessment took less time than most nurses took to read the monitor. He filed it away. Dismissed it. Moved on. That was his mistake. Seattle General's night shift belongs to ghosts. The fluorescent lights hum their monotonous prayer, casting everything in a sickly white that makes bruises look purple and exhaustion look terminal. The linoleum smells of bleach and the copper edge of old blood, that particular stench that never quite leaves a trauma hospital no matter how many times housekeeping swabs the floors. Hannah Clarke moves through these corridors like water, purposeful and unremarkable. She has trained for invisibility the way other people train for visibility. 3 years of picking up the shifts no one wanted. 3 years of eating lunch alone in the break room, reading medical journals that had nothing to do with her night shift assignment. 3 years of keeping her head down so far it's practically buried. She is 38 years old. She looks 45, the kind of wear that comes from carrying weight no one else can see. Her scrubs hang loose on a frame that was built for something else, something heavier, something stronger. There is a scar on her left forearm, surgical and precise, running from wrist to elbow like a map of something she doesn't talk about. When younger nurses ask, she says she was in an accident. When they stop asking, she doesn't correct them. Her dark hair is pulled back so tight it erases any softness from her face, which is fine. Softness is a liability. Softness is a thing she buried at Bagram with the rest of her life. The inside of her jacket, a navy windbreaker she keeps folded in her locker, carries a secret pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. It's a patch. Not regulation. Not anything you'd see on a modern uniform. It's faded to the color of old denim, the edges fraying after years of being stitched and restitched into the lining by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. The emblem is barely visible now, worn smooth by her fingers touching it during every shift break, a ghost image of a unit insignia that officially doesn't exist anymore and personally doesn't exist at all. She was ordered to destroy it. Along with the photo. Along with the medals that sit in a safety deposit box at a bank in Seattle, 243 miles from here. Along with every piece of evidence that Hannah Clarke had ever worn a uniform that meant something beyond patient care. Dr. Marcus Ashford arrives at 3:15 a.m. for his administrative rounds. His white coat is pristine, custom-tailored, expensive in a way that screams private school and family money. His shoes are Italian leather, polished to the point of reflection. His smile is practiced, deployed like a weapon designed to make people comfortable and compliant in equal measure. He moves through ICU with the confidence of a man who has never been questioned, never been challenged, never considered the possibility that his authority could be anything less than absolute. At Seattle General, it was. He had been chief of surgery for 8 years. Before that, director of clinical research. Before that, something else important that required discretion. He nods at Hannah without really seeing her. She is furniture. She is part of the infrastructure, the way the walls and monitors are part of it. That's exactly what she needs to be. What Hannah needs is to be forgotten. What she gets instead is a code blue at 4:23 a.m. in Trauma Bay 3, and the cascade of events that follows teaches her that sometimes the things we bury don't stay buried, they just wait for their moment. The call comes across the intercom like it always does, urgent but controlled, the code announcement designed to sound routine even when it's anything but. Motorcycle versus semi-truck on I-40. Driver ejected. Time to definitive care for minutes. Everything moves at the velocity of practiced emergency medicine. The crash team mobilizes. The trauma surgeon on call, not Ashford, Thank God, someone competent, someone who doesn't make mistakes out of arrogance, is already gowning up. The operating room staff moves with choreographed precision, each person knowing their role, their position, their exact moment to move. Hannah is pulling supplies. 14-gauge angiocath needles, size for 0.0 endotracheal tubes, unit of O-negative blood hanging from the rapid infuser. Her hands move with the efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times, but her hands remember something older than 3 years in a civilian hospital. They remember field tents. They remember when anesthesia was screaming and the only light came from tactical flashlights mounted on carbines. They remember when you didn't get to debate the ethics of a procedure because there were no ethics when a man was bleeding out and you were the only one between him and a body bag. The patient arrives at the trauma bay and everything changes. The paramedic report is grim: Glasgow coma scale of 6, blood pressure 72/40, respiratory rate 38 and struggling. The monitor shows sinus tachycardia pushing 142, the rhythm of a body in catastrophic distress. The attending surgeon calls for a chest X-ray, but his jaw is tight. They all know what they're going to find. What they don't know is that Hannah Clarke is about to reach for the wrong chart, a simple mistake in the chaos of resuscitation, a hand grabbing what it thinks is the trauma bay assignment sheet, pulling instead the file for bed 7 that has been waiting all night in the supply rack. The file is light in her hands. She registers that immediately: too light, wrong thickness. She should put it back. She knows this. The rule is absolute, inviolate: you don't touch charts that aren't assigned to you. But the trauma team is calling for information and there is a moment, maybe 2 seconds, when she opens the file because she thinks it's the admission notes and she's going to be helpful, going to contribute to the effort, going to do what someone with her training should do. What she sees makes her stop breathing for exactly 1 second. The file is labeled Experimental Protocol for 47, Phase 2. The subject is listed as John Merrick, age 23, admitted 72 hours ago with what the official paperwork claims is acute gastroenteritis. But the supplementary notes, the ones that should be signed by a patient consent form, show redactions. Deep ones. Black marker across the middle of the page. And the signature line isn't signed. It's been whited out. Not crossed out, whited out, the kind of erasure that tells you something was there and now it's not supposed to be. Hannah Clarke's hands go steady. Not shaky. Not panicked. Steady. Because steady is what her body does when it encounters information that needs to be processed and filed and acted on later, when right now isn't the time, but she will remember this, she will absolutely remember this. That's when Dr. Marcus Ashford walks past. He doesn't see the file at first. He sees Hannah standing at the chart rack with her posture wrong, her attention focused instead of distributed, her professional mask slipped just enough that something underneath is showing through. Her eyes are on the paper in her hands. His eyes follow hers. It takes him maybe 1 second to identify the file, another second to read the label, another second to understand that she has seen something she should not have seen. His face doesn't change. His smile doesn't waver. He simply reaches out and takes the file from her hands with the gentleness of someone removing a loaded weapon from a child, and he says nothing. Nothing is worse than something. Nothing is the sound of a calculation happening in real time. Nothing is the moment when a competent man realizes he has a problem that requires solving. You're assigned to the ICU, Ms. Clarke, he says finally, voice soft as cotton, dangerous as a blade. Not the trauma bay. Not the charts that don't belong to you. I grabbed the wrong file, Hannah says. Her voice is level. Her hands don't tremble. She doesn't break eye contact. My apologies, doctor. He nods. He files the moment away. He slides the file back into the rack with precision and walks back to where he came from. The trauma resuscitation continues. The patient's blood pressure climbs to 84/52 as fluids run wide open. Someone calls out, O2 sat climbing, 91%, and for a moment, there is the small grace of hope. But Hannah already knows. She saw the file. She knows what Protocol 447 is doing to John Merrick. She knows why his consent form was redacted. And she knows that Dr. Marcus Ashford saw her see it. The night continues. The trauma team stabilizes their patient enough for surgery. The operating room doors close. The waiting game begins. Hannah returns to the ICU, where the machines beep their endless rhythm and the fluorescent lights hum their patient prayer, and she does what she has trained for. She continues working. She checks vitals. She adjusts medications. She talks to patients who are too sedated to hear her. She moves like water, invisible and necessary. But when she reaches the break room at 6:15 a.m., her hand finds the inside of her jacket. Her fingers trace the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, and for the first time in 3 years, she acknowledges what it cost her to hide it. What it cost her to pretend to be someone she isn't. What it's going to cost her now that the secret has been seen. The patch is from Bagram. From a field hospital that officially never existed, running under siege for 72 hours while Taliban mortar fire walked across the compound and surgical teams worked under tactical lighting and the constant percussion of incoming rounds. The emblem is faded almost to nothing, but she knows every line of it. She knows the call sign. She knows the names of everyone who served under it. She knows which ones came home and which ones didn't. She was ordered to destroy this patch. To destroy every piece of evidence. To put on a civilian life like it was a uniform and wear it until the truth became a fiction she could almost believe. But Ashford saw something in her hands today. Not just the file. Something about the way she moved, the way her eyes read information, the way her body processed trauma. He saw a glimpse of what she was trained to be, and now the clock is running. She doesn't know yet how fast it's going to move. The unit board in the ICU hallway was posted at 0600 hours on a Wednesday morning, and Hannah Clarke saw her name written in red marker before the night shift had even ended. Protocol violations, it said. Her stomach dropped like a stone down a well. She'd been at Seattle General for 3 years without a single incident report, 3 years of staying invisible, 3 years of letting other nurses claim credit for her work because claiming anything meant drawing attention she couldn't afford. But there it was, her name in Ashford's precise handwriting, morphine administration delayed 15 minutes, patient 3C01 for 5 hours. She'd administered that medication at exactly 0130 hours. She had the timestamp on the computerized medication cart. She had the patient's vital sign documentation. She had everything. But the board didn't have everything. The board just had Ashford's version, and Ashford's version was what mattered. Hannah stood motionless in front of the board, her hand trembling slightly as she reached up to touch the edge of the paper. She pulled her hand back before anyone could see. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like insects trapped in a cage. Behind her, the ER was beginning its morning chaos, gurneys rolling, alarms starting their daily symphony, the smell of antiseptic and blood mixing in the ventilation system. She'd worked in worse places than this. She'd worked under fire. But something about seeing your name destroyed on a public board, something about that felt different. It felt deliberate. When she turned around, Dr. Ashford was standing 15 feet away in the hallway, reviewing a patient chart. He glanced up and made direct eye contact with her. His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then he looked back down at his paperwork as if she were already forgotten. By Thursday afternoon, the humiliation had escalated into something with teeth. Hannah was making her medication rounds in the surgical wing when she entered room 4B, where the Hernandez family was gathered around their father's bedside, Mrs. Hernandez on one side, 2 adult sons on the other, a daughter holding his hand. Senor Hernandez was post-op from gallbladder removal, his color still gray, his breathing shallow but steady. Hannah had the pain medication ordered for 1,400 hours, and her watch read 13:59 when she prepared the 4-push. She was just sliding the needle into the port when Ashford appeared in the doorway. His timing was too perfect. Too calculated. He was the on-call surgeon, which meant he had no reason to be checking on this patient right now, but he stepped into the room anyway, his white coat crisp as a knife's edge, his voice dropping into that tone he used when he wanted an audience to hear him. "Nurse Clarke, Perhaps you could explain to the Hernandez family why their father's pain medication was delayed. He gestured toward the clock on the wall with his pen, the movement theatrical. I see patients suffer unnecessarily all the time. Usually it's because someone was more focused on their personal concerns than patient care. Is checking your phone more important than this man's pain management? The room went absolutely silent. The kind of silence where you could hear the ventilator wheeze, the heart monitor's steady beep, the hiss of air through the ceiling vents. Hannah's jaw tightened. She could feel Mrs. Hernandez's eyes on her, could feel the sons watching, could feel the weight of the family's disappointment settling over her like a heavy blanket. The medication was administered at 1,400 hours per order, Doctor, Hannah said, her voice level and controlled. She did not apologize. She did not defend herself with desperation. She simply stated fact, the way someone with nothing to hide would state it. The documentation is in the chart. Would you like to review it? Ashford waved his hand dismissively, turning away from her. Just be more careful, clipboard, he said to the room at large, using the nickname he'd started, reducing her to an object, stripping away her identity one syllable at a time. We can't have patients suffering due to negligence. The Hernandez family didn't look at her for the rest of the shift. Mrs. Hernandez stopped asking for ice water when Hannah entered. One of the sons kept his back turned. Hannah knew what they were thinking. She could see it in the angles of their bodies. They were thinking, this nurse is careless, this nurse doesn't care about my family, this nurse checks her phone instead of tending to us. Hannah had saved the lives of soldiers under artillery fire. She'd worked field medicine in sandstorms that came up so fast they seemed to come from nowhere, where visibility dropped to 5 feet and the sound of mortars was your heartbeat. She'd held men together who should have been beyond holding. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that she was clipboard, the careless night nurse, the one who couldn't be trusted. The break room on Friday was warm and filled with the smell of microwaved lasagna. For nurses were already there when Hannah pushed through the door, Jenkins, Morrison, Reeves, and someone from the day shift whose name she'd never learned. They were mid-conversation, laughing about something, the kind of easy camaraderie that came from shift after shift of working together, trusting each other, knowing that the person beside you wouldn't let you fall. Hannah had tried for 3 years to be part of that. She'd brought in cookies once. She'd stayed late to help finish charting. She'd asked Jenkins about her daughter's school situation. Jenkins had answered. They'd had a conversation. And then Jenkins had been friendly. And then Jenkins had stopped being friendly. Hannah sat down at the small table by the window. She opened her lunch container, turkey sandwich on wheat, an apple, a container of yogurt. Basic, invisible, the kind of lunch that didn't draw attention. The room's temperature dropped by what felt like 20 degrees. Jenkins checked her watch. Morrison suddenly remembered she had charting to finish. Reeves excused herself to make a phone call. The day shift nurse found something extremely urgent in her phone. Within 90 seconds, the break room was empty except for Hannah and the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. The smell of antiseptic from her scrubs mingled with the scent of old coffee and something else, something like decay, like the scent of things dying slowly in a closed space. Hannah looked down at her sandwich. She was no longer hungry. She set it back in the container and closed the lid carefully, precisely the way someone who'd been trained to manage chaos in small controlled increments would close it. Then she sat alone in the break room for the rest of her break, watching the rain streak down the window, watching the parking lot below where cars came and went, where people went home to their lives. She found the transfer notice in her mailbox on Monday morning. The envelope had her name typed on it, her name in the hospital's official font, which meant it was official. Inside, effective immediately, reassignment to overnight morgue documentation and inventory management, shift 2200 to 0600 hours. The morgue. Where no one ever recovered. Where the living didn't go to visit. Where her skills would atrophy like unused muscle, where 3 years of rebuilding a civilian life would complete its transformation into something unrecognizable. Ashford had finally understood what needed to happen to make her disappear. He couldn't fire her for whistleblowing because she hadn't officially blown any whistle. He couldn't discredit her because her performance reviews were technically solid. But he could move her to the morgue. He could make her so irrelevant, so isolated, so pushed to the margins of the hospital hierarchy that she would eventually quit, walk away, disappear on her own terms. Hannah stood in the hallway holding the transfer notice. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. She was thinking about a fire base in Loga province where the water came brown from the tap and she'd worked 72 hours straight keeping 23 soldiers alive with nothing but combat experience and raw will. She was thinking about the difference between breaking and bending. Ashford turned the corner and nearly collided with her. He stopped, saw the notice in her hand, saw her reading it. For a moment, something flickered across his face, satisfaction, maybe. The knowledge that he'd successfully cornered her, successfully trapped her, successfully made her understand what happened to people who didn't cooperate. Hannah folded the notice carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She met his eyes without flinching. "Thank you for the reassignment, Doctor," she said quietly. "I've worked in colder places with better company. But this is fine. This is fine." She watched something in his face shift. He'd expected anger. He'd expected her to break, to cry, to beg for reconsideration. What he got instead was acceptance so complete, so devoid of emotion, that it seemed to unsettle him. He nodded once, turned, and walked away. Hannah touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, pressed it against her ribs like a reminder of someone she used to be. The morgue shift started in 8 hours. She had no plan. She had no backup. She had only the absolute certainty that something was about to break open, and when it did, everyone in this hospital would understand exactly what they'd been standing next to all along. The morgue basement office smelled like formaldehyde and surrender. Hannah sat at a desk the size of a filing cabinet, processing death paperwork under fluorescent lights that hummed like insects trapped in a jar. The forms never changed. Cause of death. Time of death. Next of kin notified. The words blurred together after 3 years. She filed another chart. Then another. The basement had no windows, no visitors, no patients who could see her and recognize something in her eyes that didn't belong to a night shift nurse filing the dead. Her phone buzzed. Code blue alert. Trauma Bay 4. She didn't look up from the paperwork. Not her problem anymore. Not her code. She'd learned that lesson well enough: stay invisible, stay compliant, stay in the basement where Dr. Ashford had placed her like a chess piece removed from the board. 5 minutes passed. The hospital's overhead system crackled: surgical team to Trauma Bay 4. Surgical team to Trauma Bay 4. Stat. Hannah's pen kept moving. Patient name. Chart number. Disposition. Another announcement came through, tighter this time, more urgent: Dr. Hayes, on-call trauma surgeon, ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. She turned back to her paperwork. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere above her, in the sterile brightness of the ER, someone was coding. Compressions. Medications. The rhythm of orchestrated chaos. She knew that rhythm like a song she'd spent 3 years trying to unhear. The overhead system again, continuing resuscitation. Patient critical. Awaiting surgical intervention. Hannah's jaw tightened. 20 minutes. A human body could only sustain compressions for so long before the brain began to die. After 8 minutes of no blood flow, damage became irreversible. After 10, it became catastrophic. 20 minutes meant someone was already measuring the distance between life and brain death with every compression. She stood. Her chair scraped across the linoleum, a sound like fingernails on glass. The stairwell to the main ER took 45 seconds. Her shoes echoed on the tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Rhythm. Cadence. The kind of pace that carries you into places you shouldn't go. The basement door closed behind her. The ER air hit like walking from a meat locker into summer heat, warm, alive with the urgency of people trying to cheat death. Trauma Bay 4 was a circus of controlled panic. A young male patient lay on the gurney, shirtless, ribs outlined like a map of somewhere terrible. A resident leaned over his chest, pushing down with mechanical precision. Another nurse squeezed a bag valve mask. The monitor showed a rhythm that wasn't quite dead but wasn't quite alive, a desperate electrical signal searching for something to anchor to. "How long?" Hannah asked from the doorway. Not a question. A status check. The tone of someone who needed information, not permission. The resident didn't look up. 8 minutes of compressions. No spontaneous rhythm. Blunt force trauma to the chest. We're waiting for Hayes. 8 minutes. Irreversible damage was already happening. The brain was beginning to starve. Hannah's eyes moved to the patient's chart. Mitchell, James. Age 28. The name meant nothing to her. The face beneath the oxygen mask meant nothing. But the chest cavity meant everything. That kind of trauma needed more than compressions. It needed someone to open him and find the bleed. It needed someone to crack the ribs and put hands on the heart directly. Dr. Ashford stood in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 4, white coat pristine, arms crossed, watching with the expression of a man observing a failed experiment. His eyes found Hannah in the doorway. She saw the calculation move across his face like a predator assessing whether to attack or wait. He was administration now, hadn't touched a trauma patient in 6 years. The ER was beneath his rank. But this was still his hospital, still his stage, and Hannah Clarke standing in a trauma bay was a problem that needed immediate containment. The resident kept pushing. Compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of ribs bending but not breaking. Yet. Call it, someone said. The voice was soft, defeated. Time of death. No. Hannah's voice cut through the room like a scalpel through skin. She moved forward. Her hands were already reaching for the crash cart, for the sterile glove box, for the tools that had been part of her muscle memory longer than her civilian identity had been part of her life. Not yet. The resident's hand stilled. You're not. Scalpel. Rib spreaders. Now. Hannah snapped on gloves, her movements precise, economical, the movements of someone who'd done this under fire, under pressure, with shrapnel falling like rain. Or call Dr. Ashford and explain to him why you waited for his permission while a patient bled out internally. Your choice. 3 seconds. The scrub tech was young, maybe 25, eyes wide. Hannah recognized that look, the look of someone watching a ghost walk in and suddenly become solid. The tech handed her a scalpel without questioning. The blade was sharp enough to slide through skin like it was fabric. Ashford's voice came from the hallway, sharp as glass breaking. Nurse Clarke, step away from that patient immediately. That is a direct order. Hannah ignored him. Muscle memory took over. Field thoracotomy, the procedure they taught combat medics in tents under mortar fire. Open the chest. Find the bleed. Save the life. Everything else was just details. The blade went in at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact spot where she'd opened a 20-year-old Marine with a field knife and dust in the air at Bagram. The skin separated. Blood welled. The resident watching her was pale, frozen, understanding that what he was witnessing was either the moment Hannah Clarke saved a life or the moment her civilian disguise shattered like glass. Rib spreader, she said. The tech handed it over. Hannah positioned the tool, began to open the chest cavity. The ribs resisted, then yielded. The sound was like creaking wood, like something structural giving way. Suction. Pack the field. The resident moved on instinct, following orders from a voice that clearly knew what it was doing. No more questions. Just compliance. Hannah's hands were steady, not trembling, not hesitating, but moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in a sandstorm with incoming fire shaking the tent. She opened the pericardium. Found the bleed. A laceration to the left ventricle, probably from a fractured rib driven inward by blunt force trauma. "Cross-clamp here," she said, pointing. The resident moved. "Pressure. Right side. Hold it. Time compressed. 3 minutes. 4. The kind of time that exists only in trauma bays and combat zones, where seconds stretch into eternities and the only reality is the body in front of you and the decision to save it or let it die. Hannah's fingers moved through the blood, found what needed finding, applied pressure where pressure mattered. The monitor began to change. The desperate electrical rhythm started to stabilize. O2 sats climbing, the nurse monitoring vital signs said. Her voice cracked slightly. 76, 82. 88. Sinus rhythm. The beautiful, regular pattern of a human heart that had decided to keep beating. Hannah looked up from the chest cavity. Dr. Ashford was no longer in the doorway. But she could feel him somewhere in the hospital, processing what he'd just witnessed, a night shift nurse from the morgue basement who'd just opened a patient's chest with the precision of a surgeon and the command authority of a combat medic. The question wasn't whether he was calculating his response. The question was how quickly he could weaponize it. She focused back on the bleeding she was holding. Everything else could wait. Right now, there was only the work. The scalpel touched skin between the 4th and 5th ribs, and Hannah's hands became something other than human. Muscle memory had a different name in the field, it was survival. It was the difference between a soldier going home and a body bag getting loaded. She'd done this in a sandstorm with mortars falling outside the tent walls. She could do it in fluorescent light with nurses watching. The chest opened. She spread the ribs apart with her palms pressing against bone, feeling the resistance, the give, the terrible logic of anatomy. The pericardium swelled in front of her, dark and taut, blood pooling where it shouldn't be. Cardiac tamponade. She'd suspected it the moment she saw the blood pressure, 70/40 and dropping like a stone down a well. The heart was drowning in its own sack. 14-gauge needle, she said. Not a request. A command. The nurse moved before thinking, muscle memory recognizing authority in the voice even if she didn't recognize it in the face. Hannah nicked the membrane with the needle, and the rush came, pressure releasing like a sigh, blood escaping into the drainage basin. The monitor, which had been screaming its flat warning, suddenly shifted. A blip. Another. The heart beneath the pericardium started beating again, weak but present, desperately trying to remember how to live. Sinus rhythm, someone whispered. For minutes. Incision to restoration. In Bagram, she'd done it in 3. But Bagram had better light and worse stakes. This counted the same. Hannah stripped off the gloves, and her hands trembled now that the work was done, the body's truth emerging, adrenaline demanding its payment. She looked up to see the patient breathing steadily, his color already improving from the gray of the nearly dead. James Mitchell. Just a name on the chart. Just another life that had been leaking away until someone decided to hold it together. She raised her eyes across the ER and found Dr. Ashford standing in the doorway to the hallway. His face had gone white, but not with relief. Not with gratitude. His expression had shifted into something colder, calculation, recognition, the dawning horror of a man watching his carefully constructed world fracture at the seams. He just watched a night shift morgue nurse perform surgery with the precision of someone who'd trained under fire. She'd shown skills that didn't fit the narrative he'd spent 3 years establishing. The story was breaking apart. And he was already calculating how to contain it. Within the hour, Hannah sat across from his desk. Ashford's fingers were steepled, a gesture meant to project authority, but something had shifted in the architecture of his power. He'd moved too slowly. He'd underestimated the threat level, and now he was playing catch-up. That was an unauthorized procedure, he said, his voice steady but his jaw working slightly. You're not a surgeon. You're not even ER certified. I saved his life, Hannah said. You committed gross negligence and violated hospital protocol. Multiple protocols. He slid a termination notice across the desk. Already printed. Already signed. He drafted it while her hands were still wet with blood. Security will escort you to your locker and then off the premises. She didn't argue. Argument required believing the system functioned. After 3 years watching him operate, she knew better. The security guard waited by the door as Hannah made her way down to the basement laundry room, the one place in the hospital where nobody cared to look, where the day shift staff wouldn't see her leave. Her locker was exactly as she'd left it: spare scrubs, a single coffee mug from a clinic rotation in 2015, a jacket hanging on the hook like a shell waiting for her to climb back inside. She removed her scrubs methodically, the fabric still damp with perspiration and dried blood specks that wouldn't wash out on the first cycle. The garment smelled like the antiseptic layered over something deeper, something like copper and fear and the particular staleness of a place where people fight their last fights. She folded them the way she'd learned at Bagram, the way she'd folded uniforms for 3 years before she'd walked away from the name Major and become just Hannah, just a nurse, just someone invisible enough to be safe. Sleeves in. Then lengthwise. Then in thirds, the military precision muscle memory that the body didn't forget even when the mind begged it to. She placed the folded scrubs in the return bin, polyester borrowed from an institution that no longer wanted her. The security guard signed the exit paperwork without making eye contact. Hannah signed her name in 3 places. Cleared her locker. Shrugged on her jacket, and the faded unit patch sewn deep inside the lining pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat she couldn't silence, a secret written in thread and history. The October afternoon hit her like a welcome cold when she stepped through the employee entrance. The parking lot was half full, cars baking in the late fall sun, the kind of day where people complained about the weather while secretly grateful it wasn't winter yet. She walked past the rows of vehicles toward the street, past the spot where she'd parked her 2004 Honda Civic 7 shifts a week for 3 years. 2 miles from Seattle General, she was still counting steps. A habit from the field: measure the distance, count the rhythm, keep the mind occupied with numbers instead of futures that didn't exist yet. Strip malls and coffee shops slid past. A woman in an SUV honked at something that wasn't Hannah. Autumn leaves skittered across the sidewalk like small animals running from something larger. She kept her head down, her jacket pulled tight, a ghost trying to remember how to be seen by the world. That's when the sound changed everything. The rotor wash hit like a pressure wave, that deep, distinctive whump 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 that her nervous system recognized before her mind could process what was impossible. Military helicopters. Not one. Multiple. She stopped walking and looked up as four Navy helicopters descended on the residential street, rotors flattening the power lines and trees, sending pedestrians scattering. The sound became the only truth in the world, louder than thought, louder than breath. 2 helicopters landed on the asphalt of the main street. 2 came down on residential lawns. The skids kissed the ground, kicking up leaves and dust that hung in the air like a storm. Before the rotors finished dying down, figures emerged from the first helicopter, uniformed personnel moving with the controlled precision of operators who'd done this 1,000 times. The lead figure was a SEAL team leader, maybe 45, built like a Volt, and his voice when it came carried over the decreasing rotor noise with absolute authority. Major Clarke. The name hit like a fist to the solar plexus. Hannah went completely still. Around her, a crowd was forming, neighbors emerging from houses, drivers stopping their cars, people drawn toward the chaos the way people always are. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. She saw them in her peripheral vision, the hospital staff who must have followed her, must have seen something. And there, at the edge of the gathered crowd, was Dr. Ashford, his face a study in confused calculation. The SEAL leader approached Hannah directly. Major Hannah Clarke. She nodded. Speech had become temporarily impossible. A young officer stepped forward, mid-20s, hands visibly trembling as he held a classified file. His voice shook as he read, Major Clarke, I'm Lieutenant Davis. The patient you saved this morning, James Mitchell, his Senator Mitchell's son. The murmur from the crowd rippled outward like they'd just been told the rules of their world had changed. Ashford's eyes narrowed. Hannah said nothing, her composure absolute, her face a mask of polished stone. Another figure emerged, a SEAL commander with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had watched things most people couldn't imagine. His voice was quiet, which made it more terrifying. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Purple Heart. Operation Copper Dawn, Bagram Province, 72 hours under siege with 37 casualties and a collapsed structure. Each decoration landed like a separate piece of evidence. Gasps from the crowd. Ashford's face draining of color, understanding finally arriving. An FBI agent in a windbreaker stepped forward. When we ran the TOC screen on Senator Mitchell's son, it flagged experimental compounds. We traced them back to Seattle General. Falsified research. Forged consent forms. All bearing Dr. Marcus Ashford's signature. Ashford stammered something incoherent. The SEAL commander turned to face him with an expression that suggested he was regarding something that had crawled out from under a rock. Major Clarke ran a combat field hospital under enemy fire for 72 hours straight. She was ordered to disappear because the operation was classified beyond your clearance level. And you tried to destroy her. You fabricated evidence. You attempted to discredit a Navy Cross recipient with paperwork. He paused. That was your mistake. Another FBI agent approached Ashford with handcuffs. Marcus Ashford, you're under arrest for fraud, falsification of medical records, and obstruction of justice. When you attempted to alter Major Clarke's personnel file to preemptively discredit her, you created evidence of consciousness of guilt. The handcuffs closed with a click that echoed across the street. Hannah stood in the center, for helicopters surrounding her, her past and present colliding like tectonic plates, 50 witnesses to the shattering of the life she'd built to stay invisible. The trembling had stopped. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she finally spoke to the lieutenant, carried the weight of someone who'd held the line when the line was all that stood between chaos and order. My discharge paperwork said I was terminated for gross negligence. Lieutenant Davis swallowed hard. No, It said you saved 37 lives. Everything else was lies. She nodded once. Good. She was 2 miles into her walk home when the sky fractured. The sound came first, a rhythmic percussion that didn't belong to Raleigh's autumn streets, something mechanical and deliberate and impossibly loud. Hannah's jaw tightened. She didn't break stride. The jacket she wore, pulled tight around the secret patch sewn inside, that faded unit insignia from Bagram she'd been ordered to destroy, suddenly felt thin against the wind that preceded the helicopters. 4 of them descended like the wrath of God. They came in formation, navy markings sharp against the grey afternoon, rotors shaking windows in suburban homes where people were making dinner, folding laundry, living lives that didn't include the sound of military aircraft landing on a residential street. The lead helicopter skids hadn't touched asphalt before personnel began rappelling down, boots hitting pavement with synchronized precision. A SEAL team leader emerged first, his movements economical and controlled, his uniform immaculate, his presence the kind that made the air pressure change. When he looked at Hannah, still standing on the sidewalk with her hospital discharge papers in one hand, his eyes found her like a targeting system locking acquisition. Major Hannah Clarke, he shouted, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, loud enough for neighbors to step onto porches, loud enough for the narrative of her erasure to shatter like glass. The world tilted. A young lieutenant approached her, trembling slightly, holding a classified file with hands that had probably never held anything so heavy. The rain started then, not a warning, but a confirmation. His voice was steady despite the trembling, trained to deliver briefings even when the briefing was resurrection. Operation Copper Dawn, he read, the words moving from classified to public in the span of breath. 72 hours. FOB Shank, Loga Province. You commanded a field hospital under siege. 37 wounded. 0 casualties under your watch. Your after-action reports were flagged for declassification review when the administration changed. Sir, Major, the work you did there saved lives that are still living. The lieutenant paused, swallowed hard. Navy Cross. He said it like a prayer. 2 silver stars. 2 purple hearts. Each decoration was its own sentence, each one a hammer blow against 3 years of invisibility. The crowd had grown, hospital staff had followed the commotion, security had radioed for backup that wasn't needed, and suddenly Hannah Clarke, the unremarkable night shift nurse, was standing on a suburban street in her scrubs with a military decoration being read into the public record like something that had always been true but everyone had agreed to forget. A woman in an FBI windbreaker stepped forward. Agent Torres, her badge red. Behind her, 2 more agents flanked Dr. Ashford. He'd arrived at the scene within minutes, drawn by the helicopters the way predators are drawn to unusual sounds. His face had gone the color of clinical death. Dr. Marcus Ashford, you're under arrest for falsification of medical research, forging patient consent forms, and obstruction of justice, Torres said, her voice cutting through the rain like a surgical blade. The patient you discharged this morning, James Mitchell, age 24, had his blood work analyzed at the FBI's request. 3 unapproved compounds in his system. All part of your experimental drug trial. All documented as unrelated complications in your falsified records. Ashford's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. We've identified 6 patients enrolled in your trial over the past 18 months, Torres continued. 2 didn't survive their adverse events. Their families are being notified. We have access to your research servers, your financial records, your correspondence with the pharmaceutical company funding your work. We also have evidence of your attempts to alter Major Clarke's personnel files in the last 48 hours, an effort to discredit her credibility before she could be questioned. The handcuffs came out. Cold steel catching the grey light. One of the agents, built like he could move small cars, stepped behind Ashford and with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, snapped the restraint shut around wrists that had held scalpels, that had signed falsified documents, that had calculated how to destroy a woman who'd accidentally seen the truth. The sound was final. A door closing. A career ending. A ghost finally allowed to cast a shadow. That conscious destruction of evidence, Torres said to the growing crowd of reporters who'd arrived with the helicopters, provides proof of consciousness of guilt. Dr. Ashford's attempt to bury Major Clarke's credibility became the evidence that convicted him. Hannah watched him being led to the FBI vehicle. He didn't look at her. He looked through her, the way he'd tried to make her disappear from Seattle General. But you can't disappear someone who's actually visible, and visibility, she understood now, had never been about rank or uniform or medals. It had been about someone finally asking the right questions about who had the skills to save a senator's son. The SEAL team leader approached. Up close, his eyes held the kind of recognition that came from reading after-action reports written in blood and ash. Major, your service record, Operation Copper Dawn's documentation was recently declassified. Command wants you back. Full reinstatement. They're offering you a position at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Medical command track. You'd be rebuilding their trauma protocols. Hannah nodded once. She didn't trust her voice yet. 6 months later, she walked through Seattle General's main entrance wearing navy dress blues, the faded unit patch now sewn on the outside of her uniform where everyone could see it. Not hidden anymore. Not a secret. The patch caught the light like an accusation, like a promise, like a woman finally allowed to be herself in rooms that had tried so hard to make her invisible. The night security desks at near the main entrance. Hannah had anticipated this. The man behind the desk was thin now, hollow in a way that went beyond physical. Marcus Ashford, stripped of his medical license, unable to find work in any hospital that had internet access, had accepted a position at the place of his own unraveling. Part of his plea agreement included restitution through service. Seattle General, desperate for publicity redemption, had hired him as an overnight security guard. The humiliation was architectural. It was built into every shift. He looked up as she passed. His eyes recognized her, and something in them, something that had been constructed from arrogance and control, fractured. Hannah didn't break stride. She didn't speak. She simply raised her right hand and touched the unit patch on her chest, ran her fingers across the faded insignia, and let him watch her do it. A gesture small enough to fit in a moment, large enough to contain 3 years of waiting, of folding scrubs, of accepting reassignment to the morgue with a measured breath and a single tear she'd wiped away without breaking eye contact. The ghost was done being invisible. She walked toward the conference room where James Mitchell, scar visible on his chest, the mark of Hannah's surgery and Hannah's survival, stood with his father, Senator David Mitchell, flanking them like escort fighters protecting something precious. "Major Clarke," the senator said, extending his hand. "I've read the full file. What happened on that operating table, what you did, you saved my son twice. Once from his own blood, and once from compounds I didn't know were being tested on him." Hannah shook his hand, the grip firm and equal. "Just doing my job, Senator. The Navy tells me you're being reinstated to active duty. Command position at Bethesda? Full honors. You'll be standing up trauma protocols that will train the next generation of combat medics. You'll be saving lives we'll never know about." She allowed herself one small smile. "Yes, sir. I'll be ready." The ceremony concluded. As Hannah walked toward the exit, the reporter called out, microphone extended like a weapon or a prayer. The words came fast, stacked with the kind of urgency that suggested ratings depended on her answer. "Major Clarke, what would you say to others who feel powerless against corrupt systems? How did you survive 3 years of being invisible?" Hannah stopped. She turned toward the reporter, toward the camera, toward the world that had tried so hard to make her nothing. The unit patch on her chest caught the light. Behind her, through the glass doors, Ashford sat at his security desk, still watching, still calculating, but now he was calculating against someone he could actually see. "Power is not a title," Hannah said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Power is the ability to help." She walked into the Maryland sunlight, navy blues bright against autumn, the patch visible at last. Behind her, through glass and rain, Ashford's hands gripped the edges of his desk, the same hands that had destroyed consent forms, altered files, tried to erase a woman whose real name was Major and whose real power had never required permission to exist. If you loved Hannah's story of resilience and hidden strength, subscribe to our channel for more stories of people who changed everything by refusing to disappear. Hit that like button, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Let's talk about it. Thanks for watching.